Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to WebAIM for having me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. My name's Sam. I'm a digital accessibility consultant at a place called Intopia. We are a digital accessibility and inclusive design consultancy. We're based in Australia, but we have folks also in New Zealand and Canada as well. So today I'm here to talk to you about actually shifting left. Shifting left being a term that we talk about a lot in the industry that I think is both well-defined and ill-defined at the same time. And I want to talk about shifting left, and I will define that specifically for designers. So the kind of what are the pragmatics of actually doing the work of having folks in design teams do more technical accessibility work. Begin with a pun title that didn't work the first time I gave this talk, and yet it's still here. So I want to talk to you about why am I qualified to talk about design? What are my designer fides? So as an accessibility consultant, I work with designers quite a lot. I get placed into design teams. I get placed into development teams working with designers. I get placed into organizations where I have to work with a number of teams, one of which are design. So I kind of come across a lot of different ways that design teams work and a lot of different ways that kind of design knowledge is inside these large organizations or kind of working on large digital products. My formal education as well is in design. I have a degree in interaction design, and I've myself worked at multiple organizations as a designer. So before I got into digital accessibility, I spent some time as a UX UI designer, and it was through that I got into accessibility. I also teach two university design subjects, which is a great passion of mine. And I recently co-authored a paper that looked at kind of redefining how we think about interaction design. What is it? What do we talk about interaction design when we talk about it over time? But I wouldn't be a good Australian presenter if I didn't immediately sabotage my talk by letting everyone know that sadly that paper has 0 citations at the moment. Just making sure to cut myself down to size. I tell you all of these things about my background in design because I know as a designer that what I'm going to talk about in this talk may come across as kind of generalizing, maybe sometimes a little bit insulting. I really hope not. I just want to assure you that I do love design. It is a passion of mine, and I think about it a lot, and I teach it. So I mean all of what I'm about to say with the utmost of care and love. So this talk is called Technical Accessibility for Designers, and really it has kind of two different audiences, this talk. It's a guide for designers themselves wanting to cultivate their technical knowledge about digital accessibility. But it's also a guide for people who want to cultivate technical accessibility knowledge in designers. So this talk is also for software engineers, for testers, and for people like myself, accessibility professionals. So how do we understand where design is and when we want them to kind of learn more or pick up more responsibility with regards to digital accessibility. So I want to begin with a question because I think it's good to kind of always question the premise of a talk, right? Why should designers cultivate their technical knowledge is really the question I want to ask. And how I want to interrogate this question is by looking at very broadly the process by which a digital thing gets made. So on my screen, I have a visual representation, very broadly speaking, of like the product development journey, a simple set of icons moving from left to right. On the far left side, we have the product imperative. You know, there has to be a reason that is often determined by a product owner or a business, for example, that something needs to be made, a website or an app or a page. So we have a product imperative that then might move into research. So how viable is this idea? It might then move into design. So what might this idea look like and how might it work? That then moves into the engineering phase. So this is the building of the digital product. The engineering phase then might move into quality assurance or testing, and then you launch the thing, then it's done. So very broadly speaking, this is how digital things get made. And in large organizations where there is a kind of a low or early maturity with regards to accessibility, if there is accessibility consideration at all, the weight or responsibility of doing technical accessibility work falls on engineering and QA, right? It's up to the engineers to say, like, how am I going to build this in a way that's accessible, if they think about that at all? And testers to be like, how am I making sure that what's being built works with different input methods, for example? They might do keyboard testing. So the weight of kind of the responsibility of accessibility in low maturity organizations sits on engineering and QA. And I have an image here above those two roles now, a screenshot from the film Encanto. It is Louisa Madrigal, one of the Madrigal sisters, holding up a very heavy rock over her head. And what I mean by this image is that, these teams are under a lot of pressure in that scenario to do all this heavy lifting, to do all the accessibility work. And what this means then for those two roles is that time and effort is wasted on something that can come in difficult to make accessible. I've worked with so many teams where design has not given many, if any, considerations to accessibility. Given it to engineering, you have some terrific, faithful engineers in that team who know about accessibility, and they're like, what do I do with this? I'm not in a cultural position to challenge the designer significantly. Everything's already been signed off. They really love this hyper interactive table that's going to be very hard to make accessible. So time and effort can be wasted on kind of that grind, that difficulty. The other issue is that when all of the accessibility responsibility falls on engineering and QA, it kind of relies on the very particular knowledges to achieve an outcome of something that is accessible, right? Engineers can't be thinking about accessibility, at the research phase, at the kind of what does the shape of this product look like as a proposition phase. They have limited tools. I mean, they have a vast amount of tools, but they fundamentally have limited tools with which to solve accessibility problems. And QA is the same, right? They can really only respond to what's come in. When we talk about the end product in this scenario, then that is kind of less likely to be technically accessible on release because of what I've just mentioned. And it's much less likely to be an inclusive and equitable outcome. So more than just meeting kind of technical accessibility requirements, it's much less likely to consider a kind of a broader set of needs in the end. So we talk then in the industry about shifting left. And my design here, my really broad diagram of an icon representing each role: product, research, design, engineering, and QA, where there was accessibility sitting over the engineering and QA roles. We talk about shifting left, and we mean by this that the responsibility moves up the line. So off engineering exclusively and QA exclusively, up to design, up to research, and up to product, so that each of these roles has a part to play in thinking about accessibility and then passing that back down the line. Each of these roles who receive something from the previous one have received it, and it's been influenced by a consideration of accessibility. So I want to define that again. Shifting left means integrating the concern of digital accessibility earlier into the development of a digital thing. So let's come back to this question. Why should designers cultivate their technical knowledge? Well, it's to mitigate the likelihood of the handover of something to their engineers that's going to be difficult to implement accessibility. And fundamentally, it's to contribute to the figuring out of how to implement something accessibly, a responsibility previously, as I've described, with fundamentally developers. And so what this talk is about in a small sense and in a big sense, and in a way that will make a bit more sense in a minute, is design annotations. Now, I hear a bunch of silent groans, and I would be doing the same. I promise you, this is a different take on annotations. It's a new take, I hope. But what I'm looking at on the screen here is the representation of how a designer would annotate tab stops in their Figma file. So it's just a series of numbered squares, each of which with an arrow indicating a tab press. On my screen now, I have the annotation for different heading levels. I've got an H1 and an H2. These are heading levels available to us on the web. I have a possible annotation style for reading order. So a designer might place a number next to text to dictate a very specific reading order. I have now an annotation component for a navigation landmark with an accessible name of main. And I have an inscrutable keyboard shortcut annotation, Alt-Shift-W. I'm not sure what that does. It might do the washing or something. But accessibility annotations, let's define those. So for me, they're a way for designers to specify for engineers technical accessibility information that is not visually apparent or present in their design document. That's really key. Annotations are about surfacing the stuff that is not visually apparent or present in the design document. But again, I think we should question. We shouldn't just say, hey, designers should pick up technical responsibility for accessibility and they should annotate it in their designs. I think it's always important to interrogate when we're talking about shifting left, is this what we should be shifting left? So I've got a question on the screen which says, wait, should this even be a design responsibility? And I think fundamentally that if anyone is planning and documenting technical accessibility requirements prior to them getting to engineering, that is a great thing. So fundamentally, planning and documenting this stuff is a good idea. But for me, design is a great modal fit. And by this, I mean design, often digital design, works in software like Figma that gives them a great amount of flexibility to kind of do annotations work, to kind of move things around the screen with a lot of lightness, with a lot of flexibility. You know, design kind of works in this way in software that allows them to make changes and decisions all the time. There's not a huge commitment to drawing a new design or drawing a new annotation in Figma. So design is a good modal fit in that sense. I think as well, though, that design is a great cultural fit for this work, and they are this because design is in my experience kind of very discursive practice, right? Design works by way of lots of discussions and lots of back and forths and lots of kind of interrogating and lots of sharing their work and getting feedback on it. And I think annotations are a perfect thing to introduce to that culture because they really thrive under interrogation and under discussion. And really importantly, last point here, design is closest to the intentions of their designs. If you have a developer implementing a live region, which might be an announcement sent to screen reader software that has not come from design, then they're just making their best guess as to where a live region should be and what it should contain. So design are a terrific fit for annotations finally, because they have understood the designs. They're close to why things are being interacted with and what the intentions are. So a recap again, because I know that this is a lot of information. Designers should develop technical knowledge to help shift accessibility concerns left. Annotating technical accessibility information is a task well matched with design, I've hopefully proved. But, I've got a small peach emoji next to the word but, we're missing something vital still, I think. Annotations are just a tool. They're expressions of technical knowledge. They don't themselves contain technical knowledge. You can't give an annotations kit to a designer and tell them what each of these things does and then just expect that they will be able to use them accurately. Too often, annotations are pitched as a solution in and of themselves. And I'm going to show you now a number of examples that I have seen in my travels as a consultant of the misapplication of annotations. So on my screen now, I have a small design, a series of text inputs that allows someone to book an appointment, and the inputs are labeled first name, last name, and date of birth. And they have a kind of group label of book an appointment. And I've seen designers do this. They have placed a heading level next to the book and appointment group label, which could be fine. But then they've also given the heading level annotation to the labels of each of the text inputs. So an H2 for first name, for last name, and for date of birth. And then let's imagine in this scenario that gets handed over to engineers. Annotations done, handed over. The best case, this is caught early or ignored by the engineer. So it's caught in handover, and the engineer says, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, or it's ignored by them. The less best case is that these are implemented as headings and programmatically associated with the inputs. This is a less best case because if you're navigating the page by heading level, it can be a bit confusing to then not have a block of text describing that heading underneath each heading level. It can give you potentially a confusing initially confusing kind of sense of the structure of the page if it actually contains inputs. The worst case is that these are implemented as only headings and the inputs have no accessible names. And it was actually this case that I saw when I kind of picked up this example. So only implemented as headings. We have another design here now on my screen as a second example. I have a radio group with the group label appointment type, and there's 3 radio buttons: short and long, appointment, and vaccination. Now I've seen an annotation, and I've got this on my screen now, where someone has put the tab stop against each of these radio buttons and then handed it over to engineers. Let's imagine in this scenario, best case again, caught early or ignored by the engineer. Less best case, time is chewed up figuring out how to do this, and maybe the idea is scrapped. So here we have that kind of churn when this gets to developers, because there can be a culture of design specifying something that has to be built. I've definitely seen that happen before. And so a developer will do their best, perhaps, to try and make this work. This isn't the default behavior of radio groups. If you're unfamiliar with these, you tab into the first one or the first selected one, and then you use your arrow keys to move through it otherwise. The worst case in this example is that this interaction is achieved and the traversal load goes from 1 to 3 tab stops, and there are other knock-on issues like the correct selection of a radio button option, for example. I've got another example now of the misapplication of annotations. I've got that same radio group lockup, but next to the appointment type group label, I have a question mark as a button, so as a tooltip perhaps. And let's imagine now that the designer has annotated how to implement technically that tooltip. So they've got a little annotation next to the tooltip saying this should be a role of tooltip. And they've got an alt for that, whatever that means in this context, which says click here to open the tooltip, double tap if you are on a mobile using a screen reader. So presumably the designer here meant that this is the text that, say, a screen reader would get on experiencing that tooltip button. We've also then got an annotation next to each radio button, and a note here from the designer saying all unselected radio buttons should say not selected if they are unchecked. For example, ARIA label, not selected, short appointment, radio button. Let's imagine now that that's handed over to the engineer. Once again, best case, caught early or ignored by the engineer. Go the engineers who are stopping this stuff, but also woe to them for having to put up with things that are coming in that don't make a lot of sense. The less best case, I'm not sure there is one. The worst case is the tooltip role is applied to the button, which is not the way that we would implement that role, and that controls have verbose or unclear accessible names. So here you see that the designer has enough knowledge to be dangerous, knowing that technology like an ARIA label exists, and they've overridden the announcements that would naturally come with each of those inputs using the ARIA label. So if we look back at that diagram from the beginning of my talk, which demonstrates the product research, design, engineering, QA to launch kind of process, we have here in introducing annotations shifted left a consideration of accessibility from engineering to design. But in the examples I've just demonstrated to you, the result of this is that between design and engineering, at best, there is now noise, right? There is noise in relation to accessibility. And at worst, at the end product, the result is even less accessible stuff. If you have engineers who have less accessibility knowledge than the designers do here, they are then applying the prescribed solutions which aren't ideal from designers, and the result is things that can be less accessible. So what is happening here, and why am I drawing attention to it? And can we even talk about annotations after this? For me, I believe it's more fundamental than a lack of technical knowledge in designers. And that's really the thing that this whole talk is about. For me, and this is kind of my thesis, I guess, modern large-scale digital design has a materials knowledge problem. So I'm talking about large design teams in organizations. In my experience, they have a materials knowledge problem. And the reason that I see for this is that kind of designers today are working in powerful software, right? Software like Figma or Sketch, if you're still there, or XD. And the problem is that software like this for designers are high abstractions of the thing that is being built. They have a kind of very visual ontology because they're all about drawing pictures and the visual representation. A lot of complex thinking happens from designers about interactions and flows and things like that. But fundamentally, they're in an abstraction of the thing that they're building when they're drawing vectors in software like Figma. So very visually focused and very abstracted. And as a result, designers don't always have the necessary experience of working with the materials of things like the web to know its function and parts of the materials, the depth and breadth of the materials available to build these digital products, and how they interact and are interacted with. So if I go back to my examples of misapplied annotations, let's look at how each of these express the materials knowledge problem. The first example is the text field whose label has been given an annotation of a heading level. Here, the materials mistake on behalf of the designer is that bold and introductory is always a heading. If they're thinking very visually first, they're thinking like, oh, I identify a heading by its boldness, by the fact it introduces something. And here, a label introduces an input. So the designer might not have a conception of the label element that's available to us in HTML, which is a totally different concept than what we're asking them to annotate. If we move over to the radio group, that has a tooltip next to its group label of appointment type and a tab stop annotated against each of the radio buttons. The materials mistake here is that the keyboard tabs to everything interactive. If we move over now to the actual annotations themselves for that tooltip, the materials mistake here is that a role is a single object. Whether or not you agree with the tooltip component itself, if you've built a tooltip before, you know that the tooltip trigger is not the thing that is given the role of tooltip. That's the content. The trigger is still a button. So the materials mistake here from the designer is that a role is a single object. Oh, look, I've built a tooltip, therefore it is a role of tooltip. The other materials mistake is that users need interaction instructions. The designer mightn't have a model of the relationship of ARIA, roles, and information in relation to HTML. They mightn't have an understanding of the use of, say, assistive technologies of an HTML element, and might just assume that they need to provide instructions by default. Here's one I commonly see as well. The designers reference the ARIA label here to override the radio button's accessible name with state information. I often see this because I believe the materials mistake here from designers is that ARIA label is just an accessibility label. Designers think, oh, this is just a way I tell someone something who's using a screen reader perhaps about this element. They don't understand the weight or power that ARIA label has, which is that it overrides existing information. So quite commonly, we give designers annotations, and we tell them to annotate things like ARIA labels and focus order and roles and reading order and, say, landmarks or HTML elements. And my thinking here is that even when we arm designers with information about these concepts, we're still up against the materials knowledge problem. So another recap. Which I hope helps. So designers should develop technical knowledge to help shift accessibility concerns left. Annotating technical accessibility information is a task well matched with design. So far, 2 checks. But with a small peach emoji, to effectively develop technical knowledge in designers, we need to meet designers' materials knowledge where it is. Now, when I say designers here, I don't mean all designers. Everyone's different, right? Broadly speaking, we need to understand that the way designers work is not with the materials themselves, it's with an abstraction of it. So we need to meet designers' materials knowledge where it is. And that kind of brings me finally now to hopefully the promise of my talk, which is actually shifting left. What is technical accessibility for designers? And here's what I propose. Designers looking to develop their technical accessibility knowledge should begin with concepts that are amenable to a lower materials knowledge. Using the following, annotations can then be used as a tool for developing an understanding of these concepts. So I'm suggesting that designers use a reduced number of tightly templated, highly deliberate annotations, that these annotations make almost no reference to specific code solutions, and that designers annotate early, really early, not as the thing they do just before handing them over to engineers, and they practice annotations critique. And fundamentally, this means if you're beginning annotating, if you have an annotations practice, considering reducing what you annotate. So concepts I don't recommend annotating are things like any interactive roles, no role of button, no role of combo box, no role of link, for example. I don't recommend designers annotate landmarks, so say the nav element or the role of banner, or regions, say the role of region. I don't recommend designers annotate ARIA labels, ARIA described by or ARIA labeled by, or any other ARIA for that matter, or reading order or focus order. Now, you may be saying there are exceptions to these. Of course, there are exceptions to these. Broadly speaking, if you are kicking off an annotations practice, if you want to give designers more responsibility for technical accessibility, I don't recommend starting with those that I've just listed. However, concepts I do recommend annotating are as follows: heading levels, text alternatives for icons and images, focus management, and live regions. My thinking here as well is that less concepts gives designers the space and focus to develop a deeper understanding of each. So the next section of this talk, which is the last section, is for designers. So I'm speaking directly to designers now. So if you are familiar with accessibility, this is the part in which I give a description of what each of these concepts means. If you do work as someone who isn't a designer who wants to work with designers, I've tried to word these in such a way which illustrates some of how I teach these concepts to designers to get them to understand them. So concept one that I recommend designers annotating are headings. Headings are a key navigational and sense-making tool. On the web, they have high annotational value. There are 6 heading levels available to us on the web, and we assign heading levels depending on the parent-child or sibling-sibling relationship between each heading topic. All headings that you put into a design should describe a section of content that follows. So on the screen, I have a tree here of text, and each new line of text in the tree is indented to the right to show a relationship between the text that comes on the line before it. I have a group of text here that begins with healthy food. On the next line of that tree is fruit and vegetables. Sub-trees of fruit are apples and oranges. Sub-trees of vegetables are legumes. Sub-trees of apples are Granny Smith and Red Delicious. Of oranges, navel oranges. Of legumes, chickpeas. So to annotate a heading level, you would begin with the topic of the page, and H1 goes on healthy food. The 2 subtopics of the page then are given the H2 heading level, fruit and vegetables. The H3 subtopics of each of those subtopics would be apples and oranges and legumes for vegetables. These subtopics then of the apples, H3 could be Granny Smith and Red Delicious. Of oranges, navel oranges. Of legumes, chickpeas. Headings are also uniquely the only markup or code I recommend we should be prescribing as designers in our annotations. So often I tell designers, write your heading levels out as a tree like this, and begin by figuring out what heading levels to give your headings in this way, divorced from the design. Often I see designers learning about heading levels for the first time can get stuck on the visual size of a heading, and can kind of gaslight themselves into thinking that, this really small heading, it cannot be an H2 on the page because it's so visually small. Of course, you should always query the design when that happens, but kind of writing them out as a tree is a way to see the relationships between what each of those headings is about. I also recommend designers annotate early. Putting heading level annotations on a design is a great way to interrogate the design for what's not working in it or what's missing a section heading. I often see designers not thinking about headings in this way until they start annotating them. And let's take those annotations to critique. Design flourishes and fundamentally exists in this way of kind of taking something you're working on to a group of your peers and getting their feedback on it. Annotations should be no different. Take them in, talk about them, have people query why you've annotated something in a way, have people validate why you've annotated something in a certain way. And really, I recommend applying this approach to anything that you annotate in your designs. To annotate early, it's a great opportunity to trouble the design concept for accessibility issues. In that way, annotations are a kind of lens for self-critique, and then to take those annotations to a design critique, to bring them to a kind of constructive dialogue about why we've made the choices we have. And this part of the annotations practice helps develop knowledge. It's the learning part for designers. And I think this can be forgotten or misunderstood by folks who don't work in design and are recommending annotations, that design works in this way of designing early, doing things like wireframes, and then seeking feedback and seeking input from their peers. And annotation should slot into that kind of way of working. So the second concept I want to talk about is text alternatives for images and icons. So the way I would relay this to designers is that when we use images or icons in our designs, we need to make sure we provide a text alternative for those elements. We provide the text alternative so that someone without access to the visual information can still understand the graphics intent or function. It's also worth designers knowing that engineers have a multitude of different ways of pairing the text alternative with the image. And what's important for designers to know is not the technical specifics of how engineers achieve this, but rather that there are 4 key ways to use an image that we need to think about when annotating. So I've got a stock photo here by someone called Jose Chinchilla from Unsplash of birds on a wire. And we could say this image is informative in its context. The second image type might be decorative. I have here a squiggle that separates maybe paragraphs of text. I have a search icon next to the word search, and so it could be argued as redundant here. These are considered decorative images. The third type would be a kind of functional image or icon. Here I have a bell icon that maybe is the content for a notifications button. And then the last of the 4 image types designers should know about is that there are complex images. Here I have a small image of a map entitled Population Fall in Ireland from 1841 to 1851. And the map is kind of color-coded with different rates of that population fall over time. So this would be an example of a complex image. So designers fundamentally need to know that there are these 4 different image types and that each of them imply a kind of different requirement in providing a text alternative for those images. We get now into kind of the component design of an annotation. And I spoke about kind of tightly templating how designers should annotate stuff. And by this, I mean that they need to be provided components for each of these 4 annotation types that I'm going to run through. The first one was headings. The second one is text alternatives. So here I have a mock-up for the component design for annotating text alternatives. The component has a clear fixed heading for designers that just says text alternatives. It has templated text for them to then fill out with their own context. So either description goes here or no description and the graphic is hidden. Here I have an example of that in practice. I have a picture of 4 different assistive technology types, the logos for those. The text alternative for the image reads, a collection of logos, JAWS, NVDA, Dragon Naturally Speaking, and VoiceOver. So note here the lack of technical specifics because the components for the annotation is highly templatized. There's no mention of alt or null or SVG or title or ARIA label or ARIA hidden. Removing technical language mitigates prescribing the accessibility error in your handover and keeps the focus on the accessibility concept. This is really key in, I believe, more successful annotations. So concept 3 of 4, I think designers should know, is focus management. And this is how I would teach it to designers. Keyboard users navigate their position around an interface using the tab and sometimes arrow keys. And we describe each new position as what has keyboard focus. For keyboard-only users, focus is able to move from interactive item to interactive item, so between links and buttons and form elements. So I've got a screenshot here from the Utopia website. We have 2 kind of blocks of content sitting on top of each other. Each block has a heading, paragraph text, and a link underneath. And I've got an arrow indicating that focus just moves from the first link to the second link across those blocks of text. So in contrast, for screen reader users, who are also sometimes keyboard users, depending on the context, they have a similar but different focus mechanism that we need to think about when we think about focus management. They have a virtual cursor, and this navigates a kind of broader range of elements on the page than just those that are interactive. So over the top of that same screenshot of the Entopia website, now I have arrows indicating that the virtual cursor for a screen reader might move from heading to paragraph to link, to heading to paragraph to image to link, and so on. So all the information on the page that is interesting for accessibility, that has been exposed to that assistive technology. The default order in which all items on a web page can receive focus is set when the page loads. So at the top of the website here, I have a small screenshot of the header in which there is a login link and a search button. I've got an arrow indicating that by default, when the page loads, presuming that these are adjacent in the DOM, the focus order would be login first and then to search. However, when on a website in a design, we add certain kinds of dynamism to the page after it loads, we sometimes need to manually pick up and put down a user's position. We need to manage focus. So in that same visual lockup, on click of the search button, the login link next to it is obscured. And in place of the search button is now a search input with a close button to its right. So here, where would focus go, right? If by default focus moves from the login to the search, you then click the search button and dynamically a new presentation is displayed. You might want to say move the search into the input itself. And so the way I talk about this to designers is that to manage focus is to plug a gap, to respect the user's action, which is the clicking of the search button here, and to let the user know when doing that, where they are and what they can do by managing their focus into the appropriate thing that has now appeared on the screen. So some useful rules for managing focus for designers. Focus management is applicable when an element which has focus is removed from the page. Maybe it's disabled while the user is on it. The element might disclose new content above it, or it might trigger a modal dialog. It's also important for designers to know that where focus goes for screen reader users, that element is announced. Where focus is manually moved to, that element should be visible and visibly focused. And I think a great way to talk about focus management, which very admittedly is a complex it's a complex topic at the best of times. A great way to start talking with design about focus management is that it is a feedback mechanism. It's critical for designers to understand that to manage focus is to convey system status to keyboard and screen reader users. Feedback mechanisms in the language of system status is something which is very familiar to designers. It's kind of like a core usability principle. So how do we annotate focus management then? Once again, the component design is highly templatized. The component might have a heading of manage focus with the following templated script. When a user activates element, manage focus to a different element. So in the case of that login and search example that I just showed, the annotation would be when a user activates search, manage focus to the search field. Last concept now that I think designers should be annotating, and again, the purpose of this point of the talk is to work through these concepts in a way that I would with designers. So I would often tell them that a live region is an element that an engineer can mark or insert into a page that tells a screen reader to announce the text within it, like a notification, at a particular point in time. So on the screen to the right of that text, I have a speech bubble. And let's imagine that the speech bubble is marked up as a live region. If I were to render into that speech bubble the text hello, and it was marked up as a live region, the text hello would be announced. So as a designer, it's clearer to think of a live region just as an announcement sent to a screen reader. Live regions as well are another feedback or system status mechanism. And so absolutely the domain of designers. They're part of the interaction design. Live regions are similar but different as a tool to focus management, because for a live region, focus doesn't need to be moved to the notifying content for it to be read out. Often the test that I give designers for a live region being needed is, we want screen reader users to know about this, but it would be interruptive to manage their focus to this content. So I have a screenshotted example on my screen. This is from an online shopping website. And I've got two parts of that website on the screen. I have a product. This is Tim Tams, a delicious chocolate from Australia. You can add that to your cart, and it costs $3. And the cart at the moment is empty and contains no items and is just sitting with a balance of $0. Imagine clicking add to cart then results in the cart updating with the cost, $3, and now a count of how many items sit in that cart. This would be a case for when you don't want to manage the user's focus off the add to cart action. They might want to add multiple. They might want to move on to another product, but you do want to let them know that something has resulted. Their cart is updated and that they've successfully added the Tim Tams. Component design once again, highly templatized. For live regions, they might have a title of live region and a script which says when a user activates an element, screen reader should announce the following, and then in inverted commas, what that announcement is. So in the case of the Tim Tams, the annotation might read, when a user activates the add to cart button, screen reader should announce the following: item added, number of items in cart, new total is price. So raced through those because they're quite meaty concepts, but hopefully you got something from those as to how to explain the concepts and the language with which to explain those concepts. Fundamentally, we're talking about four key things here. We're talking about annotating heading levels, annotating text alternatives, annotating focus management, and annotating live regions. These are a reduced number, as I promised, of tightly templated, highly deliberate annotations. They make almost no reference to specific code solutions. These should be annotated early in a design, not at the end, and submitted for critique, especially given the complexity in things like focus management and live region. The critique should happen with fellow designers, but also with folks working in accessibility, with engineers as well, to kind of troubleshoot from a number of different perspectives, how a certain circumstance in which focus is managed might be dealt with. But also for anyone thinking, hey, this is such a small set of things that designers should be annotating in the kind of greater set of concerns that technical accessibility has. But I want to argue that there's plenty of rich detail and complex detail in these concepts still. Detail that for designers to learn over time becomes really impactful technical accessibility knowledge. Think about it this way. They've learned once they've become really ingratiated to annotating these four key concepts, things like headings have parent-child or sibling-sibling relationships. This is a materials level understanding. That there are multiple different types of images: informative, decorative, functional, and complex. That designers need to manage focus in the case of dynamic content. That notification-like announcements can be sent to screen reader software. These are really key core concepts that need to be cultivated and developed. This is kind of what is behind the use of annotations as tools. And I believe it is the responsibility for this kind of technical knowledge that we should be shifting left to designers. Thank you very much. Back over to yourselves.
Excellent. Well, always when we're talking to people about accessibility, we're often saying, not everyone has to be an expert on everything, but you should know accessibility for your role. So this is, definitely on par with that of, hey, what might be things that would fall in the purview of the designer. So it was excellent. I appreciate it. Appreciate you being up so early too. We've got a number of questions here that came in. I think some of them you probably touched on a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate on them a little bit more as we go through them. But
Sure.
at the very beginning, you had some requests for people to share your papers and the titles, and so that others can read them. And so where would people go to find information about your papers that you have?
I'm flattered. Thank you, everyone. I have one paper. If you if you search for my name, sam.hobson on Google Scholar, so scholar.google.com, you'll see my paper there. It's about interaction design.
Right, there you go. Excellent. So Google Sam. Excellent. The next one was, and I'm just going to go through these in order because I felt like they kind of flowed well that way. But the question was, were the design annotations real life examples or constructed for this presentation? So at the start, you threw up some examples.
Yeah. It's a great question. They were both. Each of those I have seen happen. Those particular instances were me recreating them for the purposes of this talk. but I have seen each of those very things. I made sure to collect them when I was putting this talk together, such that I didn't kind of misrepresent or overinflate ways in which things were being misannotated. So I can guarantee you that each of those I have seen.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, drawn from the wealth of experience you have to create that. But just a quick follow up on my own. I'm curious, are there some other really common
Mhm.
errors or mistakes that you have seen that
Yeah.
designers should be aware of and be like, hey, maybe this is something that's going outside of my expertise where maybe I shouldn't be annotating that? Besides the list you
Yes.
gave. Yep.
Yeah, no, the one that immediately springs to mind is designers annotating ARIA labels for existing links. So doing great work by expanding nondescript link text, but by completely overriding the link text that's there. So I was working with a design team earlier this year who on every single one of their Learn More link texts, they'd done some accessibility training. They'd learned that Learn More was kind of insufficiently descriptive in many contexts of what that link does. And so they'd annotated an ARIA label of a really long description for each link, which not only provided a whole set of incredibly verbose links, but overrode the link text for each of those links, meaning that folks who are perhaps navigating by voice wouldn't be able to easily speak the name of those links to access them. So that's a really, really common one I see, and often happens when designers learn about ARIA labels.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure there's plenty of others. So I appreciate you sharing an additional example as well too. So the next question was, I've heard about PenPot, a tool that supposedly brings designers and developers closer when it comes to accessibility. Have you ever used it? Any comments on that or tools like that?
I wish I could say I have. Sorry, I haven't heard of that one. I do really agree with bringing designers and developers together. I think that's a problem that we have across the industry is that there isn't enough collaboration, and when there is more collaboration, things get a lot better. So I did mention in the talk that annotations should be taken to critique, and normally critique of design work is done with just designers alone, but I think would really benefit from including engineers, software engineers. And so often there's a kind of handover process if it's not suitable for engineers to join design critiques. There's a handover process between a number of different roles involved in building a design out into a story, which then informs what gets built. And it can be in those sessions that maybe annotations are presented to, say, engineers for their input. Engineers often have a lot of knowledge about how something should be built. They might have existing accessibility knowledge it's worth talking about with them. But no, collaboration is essential here. Sorry, I don't know that specific tool.
Yeah, no worries on that. But I mean, I think the point's clear there. Like the more you're collaborating with some of this stuff, the better, and getting some of that feedback and just not only relying on the annotation, but those conversations as well too are going to be important, however they're transmitted. So excellent. Let me mark that one. There we go. So the next set of questions deal with a couple of the items, and I think you elaborated a little bit on the end on this of why you chose some of the items you did, but some of the people were asking about things like, and I'll go through them in order,
Mm-hmm.
like why avoid annotating reading order, and some of the people posted some
Yeah.
comments on that, but what is your
Yep.
take on that? Why do you put that on? And actually, they dropped it away and I didn't, but can you pop your slide deck back up and go back to the do not list for the
Yes.
annotation, right?
Yeah.
That's
Of
what I
course.
mentally, that's how
Yeah.
I titled it.
Yeah. Yeah. So apologies. I'm just going to move back through my slides here. Actually, I'll go directly to it to save folks from having to look at that. Um, so yeah, this is a spicy slide.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we had a number of comments about it, so
Yeah.
it's like, let's just pop it back up here for us.
Yeah. No, it is a spicy slide. And look, to talk directly to the reading order question, of course, there are occasions when you should annotate reading order. But my experience has been that for design teams picking up annotations with a kind of new or burgeoning understanding of accessibility, reading order is not a great idea. One of the things I see happening a lot is designers suck up all of their time annotating the reading order of everything. Often understanding reading order requires an understanding of uh, concepts like DOM order, for example, which designers might necessarily have. And so I've seen that when reading order is given to designers, they can annotate the reading order of everything. And this creates a really complex artifact for developers to read, and it uses up a lot of time for designers. And then you can see the other thing happening, which is that designers like to kind of think about reading order is entirely up to them to design. And so they might design a kind of really snaky path through something, which then results in a hugely difficult thing for someone to build, where designers are making choices on, oh, I think someone should get this piece of information first, and this one next, and this one next. And so coming up with custom reading orders. And when you annotate reading order at all, it should always be, if you do annotate it, for really small instances of where there is reading order strangeness. So that would be my advice as to why not to at least start with annotating reading order, because it requires this kind of knock-on understanding of a number of concepts that I see resulting in the misapplication of reading order annotations.
No, excellent. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, focusing on, yeah, it was funny because when you were talking about the part of them then wanting to maybe think they had the freedom to create a custom reading order or whatever,
Yeah, yeah,
I could definitely see that potential. So, staying on focus for, what's going to be, the biggest impact makes a lot of sense, and
yeah.
kind of staying in the lane a little bit. Excellent. Besides the reading order, another one that people are asking about was the different landmarks and regions, and why you'd recommend that they not, because that seems like a bigger design thing on the page.
Yeah, yeah. Look, this one, I've had many people ask me about and disagree with me on, which is wonderful. I see the same thing happening here, right? Like, I think when you give the designers with a low materials knowledge the power to annotate landmarks, they have to understand what is available to them and how they work. And I haven't seen a lot of success with designers looking at their design and being able to, if they don't have a good knowledge of HTML, being able to pick out where the landmarks are. So designers, because they work in a different from a different knowledge. They don't look at a page and think about it in terms of that kind of structure in the same way that we do, who might know HTML. So they might argue that a nav is one thing when we would say in HTML it is not this. I've then seen confusion come from understanding the difference between landmark roles that come from the use of native elements versus giving an element an actual role of that landmark in ARIA. Regions are the same. I think there's just a lot of kind of a lot of opportunity for misuse and a lot of presupposed knowledge. And I think landmarks and regions are really important, but I think that they belong to people who have control over those directly. And also because designers can not quite understand when they propose a design what the developer has control over as well, and what they're using and the ways in which they're working, and sometimes the prescription of landmarks of regions can interfere with that.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And there's definitely some comments on that. About people talking about, sounds like the developers may need to link up with the designers and learn from them too, and some flow back and forth on that. So it just
Absolutely.
furthers that collaboration that you were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
The next one, curious why you'd recommend designers provide general notes rather than a specific code or solutions. I think you've touched on that, but if you could elaborate just a little bit more on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, but it's really fundamental. I think it helps teach us the designer's concepts, and it's more approachable for designers not to have to learn things like what is an ARIA label, what is ARIA labeled by. It allows them to just focus on the fact that things need text alternatives, that things need focus management, rather than saying this is the actual way that you solve this. It's about not misprescribing when trying to achieve an outcome, and also not locking in a software developer to a particular solution as well. They may not have the ability to give something an ARIA label, and if designer prescribes that, that then may cause some friction or some slowdown, or the developer may ignore it because like, oh, I can't, I don't have access in this component to an ARIA label. So I'm not going to do it. So I think there's a number of reasons. Misprescribing and the kind of paternalism of designers telling developers how to technically implement something. And also it connects as well, in addition to those two things, to this culture that I see a lot of, which is that when designers give something to developers, you can get developers who believe they need to do exactly what's been given to them because that's the culture of design in their organization. It's been signed off, right? That's a big, weighty, scary term. Developers feel like, oh, if the ARIA label's been signed off, I have to implement the ARIA label because if I don't, then I'm changing the will of the designer, and I don't have the permission to do that, right? So I think teaches designers to stick with the concepts. It avoids misprescription. It allows developers the freedom to implement things the way they want. And yeah, for those reasons, I don't suggest technical specifics in annotations.
Right. Nope, for sure. Let's hit a couple of them pretty rapid. It looks like a few more dropped in, so we'll see if we can knock out a bunch of them. But so this presentation was wonderful. However, the first and previous presentation before this one, when it came to using ARIA and text alternative, like the use of decorative, where do we differentiate which to follow since the content on documents should coordinate with the web content? That was a mouthful.
I don't think I quite understand the last part of that question. Sorry, the content of documents and the content of web content.
The last one was on I was just reading it, so it was popped up. So it was my first read through it too. So I apologize I didn't synthesize it for me, but let me take a stab at this one right here. So they're talking about on marking it as decorative.
So right, so is it about like this larger question of when is something decorative versus when it's another type of image?
I think so. But I think they're talking about something else. Let's skip that one. Let's get through a couple more, maybe loop back around to that one when I got a minute to digest it. But did you use designers terminology or accessibility terminology in the presentation?
I tried to use designers terminology. Obviously, there is some overlap there when I talk about things like focus management, which isn't the terminology of designers. But I think calling out the use of terminology is foundational to this whole discussion. The materials knowledge problem points at the fact that designers have a different way of thinking about things and a different set of knowledges that annotations need to be cognizant of, that folks working with designers looking for them to pick up annotations need to be cognizant of. So yeah, I think in describing these topics to designers, I use things like system status and feedback mechanism. Those are languages of designers that we don't as commonly see associated with concepts like focus management and live regions. So yeah, language is really key to this.
Excellent. And then the last one we have time for today that I'm going to drop in. There were a few other great ones, but we'll wrap up with this one. What about shifting even more left to research products, ideas, etc.?
Yeah.
Do you have on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree totally. I think that shifting even more left is a part of shifting left. I'm focusing on what it means to shift left to designers, and I'm talking about like we can shift technical concerns left to designers. We wouldn't then shift technical concerns up to say research. We would shift a different type of concern, and so I think my talk focuses on what gets shifted left from engineers upwards just to designers, but there's whole other talks that center on those other left shifts. So absolutely, product design, you've got organizational culture above product, all that kind of stuff is absolutely key. My focus is just on when we talk about what we are shifting left from engineers to designers, we're talking largely about technical information.